Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon seminar on turning Africa's vision into the future, turning Africa's future vision into reality. It is an extreme honor for me, Otilia Anamaunganidze. I head special projects at the ISS to chair this seminar today, where we launch Dr. Yaki Silia's book, Africa First, which you'll see on your screens before you now. We're extremely honored that Dr. Yaki Silia will introduce us to the substance of his book, but also that he will do so in conversation with Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, the current Chief Executive Officer of the NEPAD AU Development Agency. Between the two of them, they will take us through what is currently Africa's reality and hopefully what we can be able to do to shape Africa's future. In his book, Dr. Silia looks at a range of interventions that need to be put in place in order to see Africa moving from where we currently are to a continent that prospers, a continent with sustainable development. And so this afternoon, in this conversation that we have, we take you away from what I feel has been the great focus over the past month or 2 months, which is a focus on the now. We take you to a focus on what could happen on the African continent going forward. Dr. Yaki Silia, who will give the first presentation, will focus on 3 key things. He will focus on where Africa is at the moment, what has led us to be in the condition that we are in at the moment. He will then also focus on what Africa's trajectory right now is. And then the important part, I believe, of Yaki's work and his book is he will focus on what interventions can be made to improve Africa's future. Without wasting much time, I'll hand over now to Dr. Yaki Silia.
Thank you very much, Otilia. So the cover of the book is up on your screen, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. The book really comes from a single graph, and I'm not going to show more than the single graph. On the left-hand side, we see average levels of income per person from 1990 until 2040 at the bottom. And we see a blue line, the top line, which is the average levels of income in the rest of the world. In other words, the world except Africa. And in the bottom green line is average incomes in Africa. Up until 2020, this is a forecast. So this is data. From 2020 till 2040, it's a forecast that I draw from the International Futures Forecasting model that I use in the book. Now, the story is very evident. There is a widening gap between the average levels of income in Africa and that in the rest of the world. That gap has been growing since independence. In the 1990s, average income levels in Africa was about 45% of that in the rest of the world. It's about 27% now, and by 2040, it will be 23%. So Africa, things are improving in Africa, but Africa is falling further and further behind the average levels of income in the rest of the world. This is despite the fact that we expect Africa's 55 countries to grow at an average rate of about 4.6% to 2040. The growth rates in the rest of the world will be about 3%. But because Africa comes from a low base, the impact of even that level of modest growth is not sufficient to close the gap. So Africa First really asks the question, what needs to happen to accelerate the progress in Africa and to start closing the gap between the average levels of income in Africa, where things are improving but not rapidly enough, and that in the rest of the world. So there are 16 chapters in the book, but the key thing is that I spend 11 of those chapters looking at 11 sets of interventions that should help Africa, place Africa on a different trajectory. So there is a chapter after I look at where Africa has come from, its historical context, I look at demographics. When and how does Africa get to its demographic dividend? Africa, in actual fact, is about 30 years away from entering its demographic dividend. How do we accelerate that? What would be the impact of improving basic infrastructure, health, water, sanitation in Africa, and what impact would that have on the continent? What impact would better education have? We all believe education is the great good. But how do we model that impact, both in the quantity and the quality of education? What would be the impact of an agricultural revolution? African leaders speak about agriculture a lot, but in actual fact, if you look at Africa's history, then agriculture has not been at the forefront, particularly smallholder agriculture. Then there are two sets of interventions, social grants and Made in Africa. Made in Africa really deals with the industrialization of Africa. Africa needs to go, what we refer to, up the manufacturing escalator. The manufacturing escalator is important because manufacturing changes the productive structures of economies. It changes the services sector and it changes productivity in the agricultural sector. But once you embark upon an industrialization strategy, the general impact is that it increases inequality. And therefore, social grants are important to help to counter the impact of industrialization. But social grants are also important because it is the most effective short to medium term way to alleviate deep-seated poverty and inequality. And Africa will never have enough jobs in our forecasts to be able to provide work, sustainable or suitable work for its young and emerging and growing population. Then what is the potential of leapfrogging? How can Africa benefit from the fourth industrial revolution, digitization, to speed up its growth? And the same holds for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. South Africa is the chair of the Africa Union, and we know that in this year in Ghana, Africa will establish a secretariat for the African Continental Free Trade Area. What would be the impact of trade, a free trade regime in Africa? And what would be the impact of greater stability and peace in Africa? We can model that. Some people believe that you have to silence the guns before you can develop. But in actual fact, development and instability, to a degree, go hand in hand. Africa will remain unstable, but the nature of that instability will change. Then what is the impact of more democratization, of better governance in Africa? It, of course, on the one side is foundational to everything else. But does democracy advance growth, or is it in actual fact an impediment? So we model the impact of a fourth wave of democracy in Africa. And the final intervention deals with foreign direct investment, aid and remittances. What would happen if the world really comes to the table in providing additional aid to Africa to achieve the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 1, which deals with extreme poverty? What does remittances contribute? And of course, most important, how can Africa attract more foreign direct investment, and what would be the impact? So these are 11 of the chapters within Africa First. There are chapters that deal with the impact of climate change. I model the impact of some of these interventions on carbon emissions. And then I also have a chapter that looks at the impact of these interventions on jobs. In a final chapter, I bring these 11 chapters together in an Africa First scenario, and I look what the combined impact would be on trying to close that gap between Africa and the rest of the world. It is possible, but it will take longer than most people suspect. And different interventions have different impact. For example, the ones that generally have the most impact, if at low levels of development, would be agriculture. At middle income levels of development, where much of Africa finds itself, it is the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area and leapfrogging that generally have the most impact over the long term. So the book is available on Amazon and now also in exclusive books and most bookstores in South Africa, but internationally. Ottilia, thanks very much. I'll stop there and we can then take it from there.
Thank you, Yaki. Dr. Mayaki, President Cyril Ramaphosa calls this book a roadmap for Africa's prosperity. With the work that you do at the development agency and having looked at the scenarios that are mapped in Yaki's book, what are your reflections on these 11 interventions, but then overall some of the key issues coming out of the work that you're doing, aiming at building Africa's future?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I really feel honored to be part of this discussion. And I should say that President Ramaphosa is quite right in highlighting the fact that it can be considered as a roadmap for two main reasons. First of all, it's very difficult to find comprehensive studies which combine at the same time an historical analysis of Africa's development dynamics, and on the other hand, really clarifies scenarios with a sound analytical work. I know that the International Futures Model has been very helpful, and I know that Dr. Silias is a renowned expert in that domain. So it's a book which every policymaker should read, not necessarily in order to find solutions, but at the same time in order to really find the questions that he can ask himself and try to find his own solutions. So very sound analytical work on the causes of where we are today. And the first slide that Dr. Silias presented on the gap, because a key component of the book is that gap of income which keeps increasing between what is called the developed world and Africa. Analyzing that gap in a multi-sectoral dimension, I think is a key contribution of the book. And on the other hand, most of the critical issues which regards the development of a continent are framed. I picked 5 of them. The issue of a gap, which is very well analyzed, the trends that will shape Africa's development trajectory, the critical dimension of the demographic transition, and the issues related to agriculture, industries, and services for rapid economic growth, and the solutions regarding closing the gap. If you allow me, I would like to highlight very quickly 5 to 6 points on which I intend to open a discussion. First of all, I am part of those who always try to differentiate between several Africas. And Dr. Silias does it quite well in the book. You know, the least developed countries, the lower income countries, the lower middle income, and the upper middle income. My take is that the trajectories of these 3 different Africas, grosso modo, will be different. The trajectories won't be the same because politically, economically, and even socially, there are sound differences between each one of them. The second point I would like to highlight is regarding the demographic transition. Africa's median age is 19 years. We have not gone through our demographic, we have not finalized our demographic transition, and we are facing massive numbers. For example, in terms of employment, we know that in the next 20 years, we'll need to create about 20 million jobs. So the question is, what kind of model will help us create these 20 million jobs? Will we have to repeat the experience of Chinese sweatshops, or will we invent another type of economic model? The third point I would like to highlight is the issue of aid. My sense is that ODA will disappear in the next 5-6 years. We already see in many regions of the continent that military support is confused in ODA. I come from Niger, in the Sahel region. Public aid has now equaled military support. So it's no longer the public aid, the ODA we were talking about. So I think ODA will transform itself somehow, and the original definition that we had of ODA will certainly disappear. My fourth point is on agriculture. I'm a firm believer, and this is quite well highlighted in the book, but Africa's industrialization will go through a modernization of its agriculture. There are different schools of thought. Some refer to the fact that we shouldn't give a priority to improving, to empowering small-scale farmers and transforming them in small and medium entrepreneurs. But I'm a firm believer that it will be the way to go. And I link that, and it's also quite well illustrated in the book, to the urbanization of the continent. We are noticing an accelerated urbanization, but that urbanization has a very peculiar dimension. It's with a lot of intermediary cities. So between the small village and the big town, you have a lot of intermediary cities. And if you look at how this space is structured, it gives you an idea on how you can really use agriculture transformation as a source of creating jobs. Now, the sixth issue I would like to flag, which is a point of discussion that maybe we could raise. Jackie, Dr. Celia says in his book that in Asia, industrialization and democratization have occurred sequentially, and Africa has to balance simultaneous challenges of democracy and development. I think that the scenarios regarding governance in Africa are extremely uncertain. 90% of the current heads of states who are leading African countries will no longer be in power in the next 6 to 7 years. So we'll see a new generation of leaders coming on board. My take is that these new generation of leaders will fundamentally emerge not from traditional political parties, but from civil society and the private sector. And they will have a higher sense of Africa's need to integrate. So that might change the way we look at the relationship between governance and the design of new economic model and industrialization. So let me stop there and reiterate once again that I've read this book twice, sincerely. And when I read a book twice, it's really because I like it and I want to get into knowing more about the content and open the necessary and useful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yaki, I see you smiling there, Cheshire cat grin almost. There's a number of points that Dr. Mayaki brought up. He brought up the issues around the youth dividend within Africa. You know, coming from Niger, Dr. Mayaki, which is the youngest country on the African continent, it almost goes without saying that we need to reflect on the role of young people now, but also in shaping this future to 2040. He also brought up the point around urbanization and the nature of that urbanization, Yaki, and looking to ways to ensure that in developing certain spaces, we don't leave others behind. But then there was also another point that he made right at the start, and if you can reflect on this before we go into the Q&A, Yaki, he spoke about the different Africas, right? So the different levels of development at which African countries find themselves. Of course, Africa is a continent with 55 countries to date. And I say to date because we can see more countries, less countries in the future. We don't know the shape and form of the African continent towards 2040. If you can reflect on those points specifically, and also the leapfrogging aspect, Yaki, that would be very useful, I think, in getting the discussion going. And before I turn to you and to the audience, now is your opportunity to start raising your hand and start writing your questions and comments, so that once Yaki is done with his input now, we can really get into the discussion that follows. Yaki, over to you.
Thanks, Attilia, and thanks, Dr. Miyake. Thanks for the kind words. It's a great honor to have somebody who really grapples with Africa's development on a daily basis to say those kind words. So let me start then, Attilia, with the demographic dividend. Often we say that our largest benefit that Africa has is that we have a young, growing, large population. But the reality is that because of our total fertility rates are so high, the amount of children that come through our system means that you cannot build schools fast enough. You cannot educate your children that are coming through the system and provide them with safe water and health facilities rapidly enough. So we say that a country starts to experience a demographic dividend when the ratio of working age people, that is 15 to 64, to dependents, that is children below 15 and elderly above 64, when that ratio gets to about 1.7 and above, 1.7 and above. Africa only gets to that in about 2050. So only in the second half of the century will we really benefit from our growing labor force. And labor, there are three contributors to growth: labor, capital, and technology. Africa's biggest asset is its labor force. So, by the middle of the century, the world has changed. So we have to advance our demographic dividend. We have to invest in the education of our young people so that they produce more and become a boon to Africa's development. And then you're very right about, Africa is the most rural continent in the world. Particularly the Horn of Africa, East Africa is exceptionally rural, and we are urbanizing quite slowly. Rapidly, but by historical standards, we have urbanized very slowly. Urbanization is a great driver of innovation. It means that you can more easily provide water, sanitation, and the amenities of an urban environment in a crowded urban settlement than in rural areas. And urbanization changes the productive structures of your economy. Because what is happening is that Africans are moving from subsistence farming in rural areas to the informal sector in very often slum areas around the intermediate and the larger cities that Dr. Miyake spoke about. The problem is that this is not a productive transition in your economy. What is happening is that people are going from low levels of subsistence farming to low levels of informal services. What we need to do, like China and the Asian tigers have done, is we need to invest in changing the productive structures, and the best way of doing that is going up the manufacturing curve. And Africa simply has to industrialize. And we can speak a lot about how manufacturing in today's world with digitization and the fourth industrial revolution is different from what it was. And industrialization in Africa is not going to provide jobs. What is important about industrialization is that it changes both the services and the agricultural sectors. India is an example of a country that has tried to embark on a services-led growth path. At low levels of development, a services-led growth path does not change the productive structures of your economy rapidly enough. So all of these things are important, and they come together in what you mentioned in the leapfrogging. The fourth industrial revolution, digitization, particularly the way in which Africa can use modern technology, wind and solar, to produce energy. And we know that the provision of electricity is the biggest constraint on Africa's development. So modern technology allows Africa to really leapfrog more rapidly. We did a study on the future of Kenya. We've done many studies on individual African countries. And we saw that in Kenya, electrification in rural areas is happening at 2-3 times the fastest rate it has happened anywhere in the world. So coming from low levels of technology, and with all our challenges, we know Africa can leapfrog, because when you leapfrog, you bypass old systems. You don't need copper wires for your telephone, you need a cell phone. And all of these examples are ways in which Africa will develop, but it needs to speed up its development 2 or 3 times more rapidly than it's doing at the moment. And these are all issues that I try and respond to in Africa First.
Thank you very much, Yaki and Dr. Mayaki. At this point, we turn to the question and answer as well as discussion segment. Please, in order for you to raise your hands, you go to the participants section right at the bottom of your screen. You will see the option there to raise your hand. Once you do that, I'll be able to see who has raised their hand and in what order. You can also type out your questions. I will read those out for both Yaki and Dr. Mayaki. And at the moment, there is one question that was posed by Nico Koza. And that question, Yaki and Dr. Mayaki, to both of you, is to what extent can we confidently state that the current brand of democracy being promoted in Africa, they put in brackets liberal democracy, is ideal? Is this brand of democracy useful for or even helping Africa ignite its growth? And then I've noted a hand up by Monte McMurchie. Please pose your question.
Hear me. I'm trying to get my video.
We can hear you.
Good day. My question comment is this. And first of all, I'm looking forward to reading your book. For the past 5 years, I've been in DR Congo, involved in education, doing public administration. For me, the crucial aspect, and you alluded to this, is the fact of institutions, new types of leadership coming through, as opposed to the tribal factions or the big man type of syndrome, where leadership is equivalent to rent-seeking, rent-taking, and not that of what I call abiding by the social contract. That leadership is responsibility and responding and respecting and assisting the people. And the comment meant about education. There's so many elements of education, but what is good education, which is stimulating the critical capacity, allowing the young woman, the young man to actively participate, whether it be in law, whether it be in health outreach, whether it be in the most important facet, nurse practitioner or educators out in the field. But then I'll conclude the idea that there is not one Africa, but a multiplicity of Africas, and not necessarily bound geographically by these lines that were imposed by external agents, because you have tribes, you have different ethos. And I will say, from me, what I have learned, and I know very, very little, culture in expressive art, culture in music, is for me the Grundnorm that binds a civil society together in terms of commonality, in terms of outreaching. And Chimamanda Adichie, I think, ascribes to that now. But when you think of Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, because he nailed that over 50 years ago in that book. And I reread that constantly. And after I read your book, I'll go back to Mr. Achebe and in terms of what I call refraction. I apologize, and I want to thank all of you. And then to the first interlocutor, your comments and questions were so well taken, and I've been making a few notes and intend to deploy that. I thank all of you, and I wish all of you a most excellent day, future months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a third question, and then I'll bring it back to you, Yaki and Dr. Mayaki. The question from Wonga Tabata is, how can African countries ensure collaboration between the hard sciences, social sciences, and humanities in defining developmental goals post-COVID-19? So, Yaki, you've heard the comments and also these questions that are posed to you. Liberal democracy, is that the way forward for Africa? How can we combine disciplines? And the comments that were made by Mr. McMurtry as well. So I'll hand over to the both of you before going into the second round of questions.
Thanks, Otelia. I see Monty had many books behind him, so he's obviously better read than most. Democracy is already the dominant governance type in Africa. And I make the point in the book that Africa is, in actual fact, more democratic than you would expect, given its levels of education and levels of average income. In the rest of the world, a democracy followed economic development. That was the case in the Asian tigers. It was the case throughout what is the so-called Western world. We will see what happens in China. Nobody knows if China bucks the trend. But Africans generally look towards the West, towards the benefits that liberal democracy provides, because they have suffered at the hands of autocratic leaders and military dictators for decades. So Africa, in the one sense, African leaders have no choice. They have to follow their people who are looking towards what we generally refer to as a liberal democracy. But the problem is that at low levels of development, democracy makes very little contribution to economic well-being or growth. This is an unfortunate statement of fact. As a country goes up the GDP per capita curve, eventually a competitive economic system requires a competitive political system. But at low levels of development, what is much more important than the institutional setting is the nature of the governing elite. And that's why Dr. Mayaki's comments were so important. We see, particularly in Southern Africa, a cadre of old liberation era leadership that is leading a continent of young people or a region of young people. That simply has to give. At some point, democracy will change the nature of leadership in Africa. But having said that, often the quality of democracy in Africa is quite thin. We refer to that as electoral democracy. It's not really substantive liberal democracy. And it is only when democracy becomes substantive, when there is real accountability, that Parliament or the National Assembly holds the government to account, that the transition happens, that greater accountability drives greater efficiency and growth and development. So I think that there's a whole chapter on the book on the relationship between governance, democracy, the governing elite, and so on. And we can see the difference. Where in Africa you have a governing elite that is really focused on economic development, and that is often the result of an extreme trauma. Think of Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide. Think of Algeria and the Red Terror that happened in Algeria. That's the same kind of dynamic that you've often seen in the rest of the world, in China and in South Korea and elsewhere, where a trauma shapes a country's future. But with those exceptions, and there are exceptions, many other African countries really suffer from mediocre leadership. And democracy is not really transitioning to the extent that we would hope it to do, contributing to growth to the extent that we would like it to do. So I think I'll leave it there, and maybe Dr. Mayaki can respond to one or two of the other points that Monty raised.
Okay.
Yes, please, Dr. Mayaki.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a firm believer in the fact that democracy, as it was externally imposed, is not the word, but I will explain. To many African countries, led to a certain number of dysfunctions. I'm a firm believer of the fact that, and it goes to the Greeks and to many of our philosophers, that the quality of a democratic regime is linked to the autonomy of the citizens. The more the ordinary citizen feels autonomous and linked to institutions in which he believes, in which he has trust, the more democratic a society is. And this is not evidently a simple exercise, because even in the Western world today, democratic systems are being shaken by profound questions on the quality of the institutions. You see it in the United States of America, where reaching a sound interaction between two main political parties who don't have huge ideological differences, but cannot really agree on common strategies, where you see the governors of the states of the United States of Africa contesting the federal system by having different reactions in terms of response to the COVID crisis. I see the United States of America going through a democratic crisis of its own, after having built through centuries sound democratic institutions. So if we come back to the continent, to Africa, I think the more citizens believe and have trust in the institutions, the better the democratic systems do work. What is positive, certainly, in this continent is that the freedoms, and in particular the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, has been really making huge progresses. You have quasi-dictatorships where you have still journalists fighting for their ideas, publishing newspapers, contesting the system, going to jail, but they still keep fighting. So these societies, African societies, have a huge will and desire to be free. And I think our democratic systems are in a construction process. My last point will be that it will fundamentally depend, the quality of these regimes will fundamentally depend, evidently, on how well they improve well-being and the livelihood of the citizens, but it will also depend on how well we invest in social sectors, how well we invest in education, how well we invest in health. And by investing in education and investing in health, they will create a dynamics of democratization that will help the industrialization process. I think we will have an original way of democratizing compared to Asia and compared to Europe. And lastly, women will play a fundamental role. How Africa evolves in its political regime will depend fundamentally, I'm absolutely convinced of that, on how well and how far women are liberated from the constraints in which they are today.
Maybe I can just add a remark or two about the COVID issue. I don't think we responded to that. We actually at the moment doing a study that looks at the impact on COVID out till 2030. In other words, what is the impact going to be on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? And there's no doubt that COVID is going to have a huge impact on Africa. For example, by 2022, which is 2-3 years from now, we think that the African economy is going to be about $170 billion smaller than it otherwise would have been, because Africa is headed into a deep well, the world is heading into a deep recession. We think that by 2022, average levels of income will be about $160 per person less. Now remember, Africa's got 1.3 billion people. And we think that by 2022, there will be about 11 million Africans more living in extreme poverty below $1.90. Now, over time, the fundamentals will reassert themselves. But in the short term, COVID virus is going to set Africa back a number of years. And it's going to take a huge effort by Africans and by the international community to turn that around. But it's an issue of ongoing study that we're actually working on at the moment.
Thank you very much. We do have that one other question that was posed around interdisciplinary engagement, the natural sciences and the social sciences as well.
Okay. Yes, I think in terms of public policy making, there is a paradigm shift which is occurring quite strongly. Most of the development challenges that we are facing are not mono-sectoral. You know, we will not solve agricultural problems with agricultural solutions. We won't solve technological problems with technological solutions. We won't solve health problems with health solutions. All these issues are interconnected. So the multidisciplinarity and the multisectorality will be the main driver of a solution. It means looking at development solutions in a radically different way. My take is that in the next 15, 20 years, we will no longer talk about, you know, energy ministries, health ministries, agriculture ministries in terms of public administration. We'll think about the role of a central state, the role of regional and local levels of governance, but on a multi-sectoral perspective, not on a mono-sectoral perspective. So the linkages between these disciplines will be extremely important.
Thank you very much. There's another set of questions that I'm going to pose all of them to the both of you now. I do note that Jens Peter Kamanga Derbeck has their hand up. So after I go through these questions, Jens Peter, I'll give you the opportunity to pose your question. A question that has been posed, and you've touched on it, both of you, in different ways, but perhaps to go into it a little bit more, by Derek de Villiers, is how the current crisis will impact Africa in light of the fact that the US and Europe have now their own financial constraints, and what will have to happen in order for Africa essentially to develop independently. Then a question from Abrami Potrita, which is, education is the longer-term game changer. Does the AU give enough attention to this driver of change? The emphasis seems to be on silencing the guns in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but education, Abrami argues, is probably more important. And then a question from Daniel, which is to say, after we witnessed the continental response of the AU to COVID, what would the role of the AU and the sub-regional bodies such as SADC, the EAC, and ECOWAS be in the coming decades? And then another question from Gladys Kihuria: how will COVID-19 affect the Sustainable Development Goals, especially in Africa? I've posed this question in one batch because in many ways they are related. And so I would ask that you respond to these various questions, Yaki and Dr. Mayaki. And then I'll hand over very quickly to Jens Peter Kamanga to pose their question.
Thanks, Otelia. Excellent questions. I've alluded to the impact that COVID will have in Africa in the short term. And if in another 3 weeks, we will probably be able to add exact numbers to what we think the impact of COVID will be on, for example, the achievement of a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. I can already tell you that Africa would not have achieved Goal 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Remind ourselves, Goal 1 is the elimination of extreme poverty everywhere. That means that less than 3% of Africa should be below the $1.90 income level. That is, Africa will not achieve that goal. And in the book, In Africa First, I do a forecast of extreme poverty in Africa out till 2040, which is the forecast horizon of the book. And I then model all these 11 interventions and see what the impact will be. And under the best scenario possible, this Africa First combined scenario, Africa will still miss the goal of eliminating extreme poverty. And that is because the fundamentals that have to be in place, better agriculture, better healthcare, and so on and so forth, are not in place, and they take a long time. For example, we all know, and our mothers told us, that education is it is fundamental but education and improvements in basic sanitation really, which are fundamental to changing the human capital contribution to growth, take an extremely long time to factor through the system. So if you invest, and we in the book, I make a distinction between the quality of education and the quantity of education that Africa gets. And I model these two. Now, in actual fact, in education, quality is often more important than quantity. Just think about it. It doesn't help if your kid goes to school and he learns nothing. He must learn something, and the quality, therefore, is usually important. So education is a prerequisite. No, education must accompany the other transitions, but on its own, education does translate, for example, into getting to the demographic dividend earlier, because young women and men who are better educated eventually have less kids, invest more in the education of their kids, and so on and so forth. So education, very important. I think that when we speak, and a lot has been said about the Africa Union and the REX, I've worked with the Africa Union for decades. I know the organization. I'm a great proponent of the Africa Union. But its major contribution to Africa has been in the area of peace and security. The regional economic integration, even the African Continental Free Trade Area, I think is mostly going to happen from regionals upwards. It's not going to go from the top down. And part of the problem with the Africa Union, various plans and efforts that Africa has put together, is that these are sometimes top-down efforts, and that it is eventually only Africa that will change Africa. We consistently look towards others as if first it was the West, now it's China that is going to develop Africa. Only Africans can develop Africa. China, the US, Europe, they are in Africa, yes, maybe for altruistic reasons, but largely in their own interests. The last period of sustained growth in Africa, the longest period of sustained growth in Africa's post-independent history, from 1994 to 2008, was entirely made possible by the hunger that China had for our commodities. So we exported stuff, our economies grew, but in the process, Africa has become more commodity dependent. And becoming more commodity independent is in actual fact, you do not diversify your economies, you grow slower, and the quality of the growth is really problematic. The only way we can change that is through the African Continental Free Trade Area. We need to trade with one another, because regional trade has got a much higher value content than trade elsewhere. And there are many reasons we can go into that. So regional integration and digitization, the fourth industrial revolution, leapfrogging, these are the ways through which Africa can change itself. And it can happen, but it will take a long time.
Thank you. There's subsequent questions that I hope both of you can respond to. One from Anaïs Ovrey, which is the role of the youth that they can play in reaching development goals. And then from Dr. Deirdre Clark, what role can the people that are on this video call now, this event, what role can they play? I noted that there's quite a number of participants from across the African continent, but also from outside the continent. And then I would like to give the opportunity to Jens Peter Kamanga, who has had their hand raised up for a while, to pose their question.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, presenter and opponent. Fantastic presentation, also on YouTube last week. Really looking forward to reading the book. I'm a Chief Governance Advisor with the Danish government, and therefore I guess my question will be a governance question. I think you've touched on it, both of you, but I'm really interested in kind of a little bit more granular responses. What will trigger the changes? I mean, I was really interested, and I agree with a lot of the suggestions made in your presentation, but kind of what will trigger these changes, maybe without taking much time. I'm maybe marginally less optimistic about the next breed of presidents than Professor Mayaki, even if I sincerely hope he's right, and I'm sure he will be in some cases. I think some of the underlying features are sadly still to an extent the same. Debt was one of the things I had looked at in my own scenarios over the last 5 or 6 years that would trigger kind of basically the social contract being tested. Some countries will be pushed over the cliff now with Corona, but other trigger points, urbanization is another one that I've had on my hit list. I'll be really interested in more granularity from both of you. So yeah, let me stop there. Thank you very much again.
Okay. So maybe I can come on. I can come in. Yeah.
Yes, please. You're welcome
okay.
to respond,
Okay.
and this will be the last batch of questions that you respond to. I do apologize to people that have posed their questions in writing and also put their hands up. Unfortunately, this event does end at 4 o'clock, so to give an opportunity both to Dr. Mayaki and Dr. Cilliers to respond to all the issues that have been raised. That set of questions was the last batch. Thank you.
Okay. So 3 issues regarding governance. The first issue is that most of the social changes that we have been observing have had a certain level of violence. You look at Tunisia, you look at Burkina Faso, and many other cases, most of the social changes that have led to governance reforms have been somehow violent. And point number 1. Point number 2, fundamentally, if you analyze these social movements that led to social change with a certain level of violence, they were triggered by the youth. From Egypt to Tunisia to Burkina to Mali, etc. So the youth played a critical role in boosting the social change, and in order to change the governance systems, violence was not put aside. Violence was at the core of the process. So when I'm referring to the next generation of leaders, I'm referring to the processes that will lead to that next generation of leaders. And it will not be an easy drive. It will be quite tumultuous processes. And these tumultuous processes will come out of, I see two indicators. First of all, the youth is getting more and more organized, and the more they get organized, the more they sense the power that they have to put pressure and influence the systems in which they are living. So that's the first indicator. The second indicator is, I was a former prime minister in Niger, and let me just say an anecdote. When I was prime minister 20 years ago, we did a survey in order to ask populations, rural and urban, which were their development priorities in order for us to design a plan. And most of us, technocratically, were thinking that the populations will respond, we want roads, we want dispensaries, we want schools, etc. And you know which priority came first? Above all the other priorities, the priorities which came first was justice. This was 20 years ago. Justice came as the first priority. It was not water, it was not energy, it was not so it was justice. So in the deep psyche of many African populations, you have that desire for justice. So it's just a question of connecting the desire of justice to social dynamics, connecting that will lead somehow to change. You see, Tunisia was considered as, an example of economic model, and you know what happened. And it was praised as by many as a sound governance system, which could, provide export of agricultural product to Europe with good roads, good ports, good airports, etc. And the desire of justice made the system implode for a new type of governance. So I'm quite confident that this deep desire for justice will provide the path for the necessary changes in terms of governance.
Yes, we're actually just finishing a study on the future of Tunisia at the moment, and of Algeria, by the way. And a bit earlier, we did a study on the future of the Sahel. So these dynamics are incredibly interesting to watch. But, in general, in our forecasts and our studies, there is a general relationship between a country's level of development and its level of democracy. And the two go, in a sense, hand in hand. If the one is in excess of the other, generally, if you have more democracy than one would expect, given levels of income and education, often you have extreme levels of corruption. If you have less democracy, you have a buildup of tension, and eventually you have an explosion. Now, in Africa First, I model the impact of a fourth a wave of democracy. Outside of Africa, there are some that argue that there is a democratic regression. I do not believe that to be the case in Africa. In Africa, democracy is alive and well. African leaders look towards the authoritarian developmental model of China, and they look with longing eyes at the strong developmental state. But the reality is that their population looks towards liberal democracy, and they want that freedom and that justice that democracy provides. And therefore, generally, except in newly liberated countries like South Africa, you don't find a clear relationship between democracy and expectations of growth and income. Now, there's a lot that I can say about that. The nature of violence and instability in Africa is changing. For example, we see that protests and urban instability is increasing, but except for terrorism, armed violence is decreasing. And all of these factors play into the future that we sketch out in Africa First. I know that Ottilio wants to close, so I'm going to stop there, but This has been a fantastic conversation, and from my side, Ottilia, thank you, and to Dr. Mayaki.
Yaki, Dr. Mayaki, thank you very much. This is a conversation by no way that can be had in just an hour. And I see the comments from people like Dr. Deirdre Clark saying, you know, they wish the conversation could go on much longer. And I think, you know, as we discuss the future of Africa, as we discuss what needs to happen across the various sectors, there's something that you said, Dr. Mayaki, that I hope sticks and stays with people that were tuned in now and those that will engage in substance of Yaki's book, which is, it is simply not possible for one sector to be able to push forward Africa's development. We need peace and stability. We need security on the African continent to be able to do this. We also need an educated population. We need people that have access to basic resources and needs, and the ability to be able to do a lot of what we're speaking about. As we were having this seminar, those of you who may have seen me briefly pop out would have thought, what's going on? We need stable connections. And I think one of the things, whether we're leapfrogging as an African continent, our ability to communicate with each other will be a fundamental part of that trajectory. Of course, Yaki's book touches on a lot of these issues and presents a useful roadmap for the African continent, for individual African countries. But importantly, it provides a useful roadmap across the sectors. And hopefully we can get people speaking to each other. And so thank you, Yaki. Thank you, Dr. Mayaki, for your presentations today, but importantly, I think, for the work that will be done after this. A special thanks also to the Hans Seidel Foundation and to CEDA for funding this book, but also for this event.